So if consciousness/reality is a common thread that can be unpacked in the same way from a multitude of different perspectives, including biology, neuroscience, philosophy, and quantum physics, then what is the place, if any, of religion and spirituality? Welcome back for Everything We Know is a Lie, Part 5, where we will be piecing in the final piece of the puzzle, looking at how religion and spirituality deal with the issue of consciousness. And if you've been following along, you've probably been wondering where and how I might go about tackling this. But before I even begin, I want to start off by saying that this is just what I believe. You do not have to believe me, and I am not in any way, shape, or form trying to bash or discredit your belief system, nor do I want anybody in the comments to do so. It has been my continual hope throughout the making of this series that I may be able to encourage discussion and allow for people from different perspectives and viewpoints to at least acknowledge that in many cases their differences are interpretive rather than concrete. And I think that that statement is very important to consider when talking about religion. But another point I hope I've accurately driven across to you guys is that nothing happens in a vacuum, and that our reality is a direct result of our own subjective experiences. And as such, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about mine so that you may be able to come to understand how I've reached these conclusions. Because this is where we're stepping away from science and into the realm of belief. So none of this is concrete evidence. It all just comes down to experience. Now, while I was raised in a Christian household, I think I was about 8 or 9 years old when I decided that the whole religion thing wasn't really for me. And there were a number of reasons for why that was, but I think the biggest one was just that a lot of the things that you were taught in Sunday school just did not align with the science that I was being taught at actual school. And as I'm sure all of you can tell by now, I'm a bit of a nerd. I love science. So that incoherence or the dissonance really did get to me, and I became an atheist. I decided that I couldn't believe in anything I couldn't prove. And while that did lead me to a very long line of scientific inquiry, it did in some ways stunt me emotionally and mentally, purely because of the nihilism that comes with atheism. I very much began to take the view that all life was meaningless, that my life was meaningless, and that we just lived on a floating rock, who cares why, it just happens. But I began to realize as I grew up that this view was not benefiting me in my relationships with others, in my relationship with myself, nor in my relationship with the world. And that nihilism has a tendency to breed complacency to the way that things are. And also complacency to bad behavior, because if you don't think that anything really has meaning, then your good intentions don't mean any more than your bad intentions. But anyways, back to the point. I grew up going to an international school, which, even though I was an atheist, gave me the privilege of being able to talk to a bunch of people from different ethnic, religious, cultural backgrounds about their views. And because I was an atheist at the time, I was doing this very much just from a place of curiosity in trying to understand the cultural, religious, and spiritual backgrounds of a bunch of different people in the hopes that I could kind of understand that way of thinking logically. And now having these discussions in like a respectful and productive manner was extremely good for me, because even if I did not necessarily believe in those religions, I did notice the common threads that ran across them and took those on as my moral imperatives. And it is these common threads that led me to the belief that all religions are just different interpretations of the same thing. Hear me out, because I'm about to provide some evidence on this. Now, one common thread that runs across nearly all religions is this idea of loving thy neighbor as you would yourself. This is said in Christianity in the book of Matthew 22 verse 39, I think, and really was the central moral teaching of Jesus Christ. In Judaism, it is said by the Rabbi Hillel that what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. He also said that that is the whole Torah and that the rest of it is really just commentary. This is also echoed in Islam by Hadith, where it is said that none of you truly believes until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself. But once again, this directly mirrors the love thy neighbor ethic, and also extends beyond just other Muslims, but also just humanity as a whole. And while that is the evidence from the Abrahamic religions, it doesn't just stop there. In Hinduism, they preach, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. In Buddhism, this is said too, in Udana Varga, where it is stated, hurt not others what you yourself would find hurtful. In Confucianism, it is said, do not impose onto others what you would not want for yourself. In Sikhism, it is said, no one is my enemy, everyone is my friend, I get along with all. And in Jainism, it is said that one should treat all creatures in the world as one would want to be treated. It is also expressed in more ancient spiritual practices, such as those of the Navajo or the Native American tribes, that of Te Ao Maori in values of Kaitiakitanga, which is like stewardship and guardianship for all life. And those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure this idea runs deep. And essentially, across these major world religions, there is a clear moral thread that emerges. Compassion, empathy, and universal kindness kind of form this universal ethical principle. But if you're still watching, you're probably listening and thinking, okay, Jazz, but like, what the fuck does this have to do with quantum physics and neuroscience? And to that, I would say I have a proposal, a hypothesis, if you will, because again, this is not yet falsifiable. And I'm gonna pose it as a question. What if we are just different expressions of the same universal consciousness? And this idea that we should love our neighbor as we would ourselves is because our neighbor is ourself. You are exactly who I would be had I been born in your body and grew up with your experiences. Like, that is just fact. But yet we tend to, from this place of the default mode network and our ego, focus so much on our differences and our divides that if someone wrongs us, we'd like to think that had we been in their shoes, we would have acted differently. Truth is, you would have done the same thing had you been born them. The way that I like to think about consciousness, and once again, this is not scientific, just my belief, you don't have to believe me. What if consciousness is non-local and exists separately to the human form? Now, if that were the case, then I believe that consciousness would be analogous to the ocean and our bodies sort of like a cloud. Now, this is not to say that we are God or anything like that, but rather that we hold a piece of that wider consciousness within us. And that when we die, our consciousness, like raindrops, fall from the sky and reconnect with the water, the ocean, where it becomes one with the totality of everything again. Which once again aligns with Federico Fagin's quantum information theory that states that all of this is just a projection of some more deep fundamental layer of reality that is made up of consciousness. And also loosely with integrated information theory that explains how this material comes together to form our kind of awareness of experience. Now, most of this just comes from my own subjective experiences. And while subjective experience is not science, it is still information. And science already takes subjective experience seriously in fields like psychology. And I also think that spiritual experiences do not need to be literal or supernatural in order to be meaningful. So I'm not asking you to believe my experiences or my interpretations of them. All I'm asking is that you don't dismiss experience as irrelevant purely because it is internal. All of this inquiry kind of led me to thinking about non-dualism, which once again is heavily practiced in more ancient philosophies and spiritual practices. But non-dualism isn't really a religion, it's more so a perspective, one that pertains to the idea that the subject and the object are not actually distinct from one another, or the self and the world are two parts or two sides to the same coin. And whether or not you want to add the metaphysical view of consciousness into this view of reality is still scientifically plausible because we are not separate from the world. We exist in some sort of a fluid mosaic by which all of our interpersonal and wider interactions influence those around us. The same way that when one species goes extinct, it has a rippling effect on all those that once interacted with that species, whether as their prey or their predator. And while I do have a more spiritual belief system, non-dualism doesn't actually require a belief in gods or the afterlife or the soul or anything. It's about how our experiences are structured, and it is sort of like a way of life, a philosophy to help you move through the world without falling into this existential nihilism. Now, I know some of you are probably wondering, okay, Jazz, so what? And what I think is that if separation is just an illusion, ethics stop being rules and start being imperatives. Harming others becomes self-harm. Compassion stops being moral posturing and instead becomes rational. And meaning comes from participation, not certainty. And I believe it is in this way that religion and spirituality become functional rather than purely metaphysical. Basically, point in case, we all need to start loving each other more. So much of what is going on in the world is preying on the fact that people have become complacent. They have become complacent and hopeless. And so long as we view the world in this way of like, you know, everything is bad and everyone is evil and everyone has it out for each other. So long as we see it in that way, that is what will be perpetuated. Again, go back to the neuroscience part, like literally what we believe manifests into our reality. And it's also what we are biased towards noticing more. And when we start giving each other more compassion and love, whether or not that is coming from a place of religious viewpoints or just moral imperatives, we actually find that love returned to us tenfold. And to wrap this up, I also just wanted to say that I'm only 21, so like my views totally can change, and I am curious enough to let them. I am not set in my viewpoints, and I'm young enough to have some humility about that. I'm also actively investigating these questions and am currently proposing a new theoretical framework for understanding consciousness. Now, whether or not me and my colleagues end up being right, who knows, but I'll keep you guys posted, so stay tuned. I say this because my goal is understanding, not necessarily belief. And if I'm wrong, I want to know, because certainty is far less interesting to me than coherence. And because I genuinely believe that fostering curiosity is one of the greatest things that we could ever have the opportunity to do. But yeah, this is an ongoing inquiry, not a finished, finalized worldview. But with that said, I am curious to know your perspective on the whole matter. So please feel free to pop them in the comments, but once again, no one should be bashing anyone for their religious views. I want this to be an open space for discussion where people can find that there really are far more similarities amongst us, not even just on like a religious level, but like also on like a psychological level, than there are differences. And that when we choose to focus on our similarities over our differences, the ego quiets and we have the opportunity to view the world through an entirely new lens. And that is a beautiful thing. But anyways, I love you guys. Merry Christmas if you celebrate, and I will see you guys next time.